Welcome. In the last few demonstrations, we saw different ways to draw bark details. So essentially, we saw how to create these bark shapes and then, texture them individually. We also saw how to essentially, create these kind of deep grooves and create the bark texture around it. So essentially, what I've done in last few demonstrations is to show how you can easily draw the bark details of a tree up close. And that's real fun to do. You can have so many different ways I've shown in my demonstration of doing so. And what I want to do in this demonstration is to show yet another way of doing it. So again, I really like to draw bark textures, and it's very simple to do. As I've shown before, it's real simple to do. And what I will do in this demonstration is to show yet another way in which you can easily draw the bark details. And this, I think, is one of the simplest ways. So I just wanted to show this approach, and it's quite simple. Essentially, what you do in this approach is to simply draw these lines. So as I've mentioned before, we try to capture different aspects of bark in different approaches. I've tried to look at different aspects of bark and essentially capture that. So in some of them, in last demonstration, we saw how to essentially create these bark pieces, right? So essentially here we focused on bark pieces and textured them. And in other demonstration, here we saw how to essentially create these crevices and create detail around it. What we will do in this demonstration is to simply draw these lines. And essentially what happens is in many barks, they simply have these lines that kind of indicates a bit of groove. And essentially, your bark is simply comprised of that. And so that's what we will do in this demonstration, is to essentially, you draw these lines. So essentially these are a bit not straight line, but a bit of wiggly lines, something like this. And yeah, just overlap them. Something like this, what I'm doing. So this this kind of line represents a bit of kind of a small groove that you have in many barks. So many barks simply have these kind of grooves, and that kind of gives the bark its texture. So that's one of the simplest ways of drawing the bark detail, to essentially draw a simple bark where there are these kind of grooves. And what you do is essentially simply use these lines and essentially just draw overlapping lines like these. And what you will see, what will happen is that these kind of overlapping lines will essentially give a nice feel for kind of bark grooves. And in the end, this will give a feel for a bark where these lines are kind of grooves, and then you have the bark the top of the bark in between these lines. So that's what we are doing essentially in this approach, is simply to draw these lines, right? And simply draw them and make sure that you're overlapping them essentially. So as you can see, I'm using different lengths, so you can make some small and essentially just wiggle them a little bit, something like this, and just overlap them in a way, a bit small, a bit long. And these lines, they start to resemble the kind of small grooves that you have in a lot of bark. So the difference between this approach and this approach, over here we actually drew a bit wide groove. So this kind of this represents a kind of crevice or something like this. So this is the kind of crevice, and we drew these wide crevices and essentially drew bark detail around it. But over here we are not doing those crevices, we're simply drawing these lines. And what we'll also do is essentially add a bit of weight to these lines in the end, to give a bit of more hint for their for the fact that they are a bit of groove. So essentially these lines are in a very small groove. So in many barks you will see that they simply have these grooves, and then you have bark texture around it. So that's what we are doing in this demonstration. So essentially simply draw these lines, and you will see how just by drawing these overlapping lines you get a nice sense of bark in the end. So this is what I'm doing. Simply again overlap them, use different length, and try to just provide a nice feeling of distribution of these lines that represent small grooves in the barks and something like this. And what we do as a next step, once we have these lines done, is to essentially add a bit of weight to these lines. So so what happens is this line kind of is not really indicating a groove, because this has the same width all along. To add a bit of to make this line indicate groove, what you do is essentially add a bit of darkening, something like this. So now this indicates more of a groove. So essentially what you want is a line that is a bit thicker at the center, and then it tapers towards the edge. So this line has a good indication of a small groove, because it's a bit wider at the center. So essentially this is the same technique that we saw in this demonstration, but over here we made it much more wider at the center. And the wider you make it, the bigger it becomes, and that then starts to give an indication of a crevice kind of thing. So the more wider you make it, it starts to look like a crevice. Over here we are not making it that wide, but we are simply giving it a very small width, just to make it feel like a groove, something like this. So that's what we will do essentially. So once I'll add a few more lines over here, and once this is done, what I will do is go back and add a bit of a bit of depth to the center of some of these lines. Again, you don't have to do all of them, but essentially just simply add a bit of depth or a bit of more black width to the center of these lines, and then it will start to acquire more of a feel of groove. So that's what I'm doing. So this is how essentially you can simply draw a line, and then so essentially again you draw a line, and then go back and add a bit of something like this, a bit of more width to the center to essentially make it, feel more like a groove. So that's what, we will do. Simply essentially just, again, it's very simple. Just, add a bit of weight or add a bit more of, black to the center of these lines, and they will start to look more like a groove. And again, you don't really have to do all of them, but some of them will suffice. So as you can see now, it's starting to look, more like the groove, those lines. And if you want, you can add, a bit more line as well. So again, the number of lines that you use and the density and, the location, the placement will, all give different effect for the bark. So again, whenever you try any, true such barks, they will have a different look and feel depending on the density of the lines that you choose and how you distribute them and things like that. That's why it's just real fun. So anytime you want to have a simple drawing, you can simply draw this kind of bark, and then you can always add other elements in the backdrop to have a nice simple drawing quickly done. So as you can see, what I'm doing now is simply darkening these lines a bit in the center, and this is starting to look like a small groove, essentially. So this is kind of acquiring a feel of a bark that has these small grooves in its surface. So there we have it. So this is how essentially you can easily draw a kind of bark. This is a very common bark. So this is the kind of bark that you will find. So the ash trees have this, and sometimes when the maple trees you can see. And what you can do essentially to imitate different barks, you can make those grooves wider. And some barks they have a bit wider groove, not as big as the ones that we have seen when we drew the crevices. But again, yeah. So you can always play around with the width or the kind of the level of grooves, and then you can end up with different kind of bark structure. So there we have it. So this is how easy it is. So essentially what I did was to simply add these lines, some overlapping lines, and then simply I went ahead and added a bit of darkness, a bit of, again, remember to make it small, so do not make it too wide, otherwise it will start to acquire the feel for a crevice. And if you want, you can actually even add a bit of crevice, so that's fine. So over here, for example, if you want, we can add a bit darker. So here this becomes a crevice. As you can see, the wider I make, the more it starts to acquire the feel for a crevice. So you can always add a crevice, bit here, bit there, but again, that is not the focus of this this kind of bark. So essentially we're not making most of these lines not that thick, but a bit small, thick, something like this, to give it a feel for a small groove. So this is how easy it is. Just simply add again for this line. So again, you have this line over here, this is looking a bit flat, and then I add a bit of tapered kind of thickness to it, to the black, and then it acquires a feel of a groove. So there we have it. So this is how easy you can draw this kind of bark. And essentially so this is how you can quickly put together a nice simple drawing of a bark up close that has these kind of grooves on its surface. So there we have it. So let me just draw a bit more. And what you can do also at the end is to essentially, if you want to darken one end more to bring out the roundness. So as I've said before, to bring out the roundness, the curvature of any object, you have to have some kind of variation in its, some kind of variation in tone on its surface. So over here, if you want, you can add more lines in one end to, bring out that variation, or you can simply add those parallel lines, that we have seen in other demonstrations to essentially bring out that variation. So let me just go ahead and add a bit more, of this kind of darkness, just to, bring out the groove aspect a bit more. So that's what I'm doing. So essentially, again, you draw a line like this, overlapping lines, and at the end you come back and you just darken a bit, something like this, and again taper it, and then this will acquire the feel of a groove. So that's what we are doing essentially. We have drawn these overlapping lines, and then we have simply darkened them a bit, and in the end we have this nice feel of bark with these kind of grooves in it. And again, you can go back and make some grooves bigger than the other. You can even make add more crevices, something like this. So again, over here, if I want, I can just simply darken a bit more, and there we have it. So and then there you have a crevice over there. So over here again, if I want, just darken a bit over here, and then you have a feel for a crevice. So that's how easy it is. So essentially this is real simple drawing, real fun to do. Essentially simply darken these lines to make them grooves, or if you want, just add bit crevice here, a bit of crevice over there, and in the end you can also make the edges a bit jagged. So as it's always good to make the edges jagged, so that brings out more of the character of the bark. So what I will do over here is simply go and add a bit of this kind of jaggedness that I've done in other demonstrations. So again, just if you have a line like this, just add a bit of dark over here, a bit of dark over there, and this starts to acquire the feel of a kind of a rough edge, and that, I think, that is makes a trunk always more interesting. So that's what I will do over here. So there we have it. So this is how you can easily create a simple bark which has a grooved structure. So again, this is not as grooved as for example what we have over here. These are so when the moment you use make them bigger, they start to acquire the feel of holes or crevices in the bark. And if you make them small and make a bit more of them, then you have a different feel for a bark that we drew over here. So there we have it. And yeah, and always try to make it flow towards the end. So essentially, what I will do next is to simply add this kind of grass or ground cover over here. So you always want to to ground your trunk. So this is again, draw your grass, something like this. So I'll simply add my grass over here, and then we will take these lines all the way to the grass, so that there is a nice transition from the bark to the grass over there. So again, you just draw the grass, simply again, you draw lines like this. We have seen this in a lot of other demonstrations, so I won't explain this in detail. So simply, use these lines and, give a nice feel for the grass at the ground, so that, this tends to ground the trunk. So that's what we will do. So simply, add this grass over here. So there we have it, right? And if you want, you can even add a bit more, and then again, we can add a bit of flowers. So essentially, I will just simply add a bit of flowers over here, just to give it some more interest over here, something like this, and then a bit more grass over here. So this is how you can easily ground the trunk. And the other thing you can do always is to make this base around here a bit darker as well, so that also brings out the form of the trunk nicely. So that's what I will do essentially. So I will just make this these grooves a bit darker over here. So as you can see, what I'm doing is simply adding the line, so that there's a nice transition from this bark all the way to the grass. So essentially, there is some white spot over here, and then I will simply add more lines over here. So there we have it. So this is how easily you can create this kind of nice feel for bark. And then I will simply then go ahead and just extend my grass. So once you have this kind of bark texture defined all the way over here, then I simply again simply extend the grass, so that there's a nice transition. So this area a bit darker serves to ground the trunk, and also serves to have a nice transition from the grass onto the bark. And then I will simply add a bit more grass to give it a nice shape like this, something like this. So I'll just simply add a bit more grass over here. So this is how easy it is, to essentially draw a bark of a tree. You simply draw these, overlapping, not overlapping, but kind of, yeah, these kind of lines. And then you simply, darken them a bit to, like this, to essentially give the feel of for a small groove. And then you have a nice feel for a, grooved bark. And then you can also go ahead and add a bit of, darker, bigger crevices and things like that, just to give it a bit more character. And then finally, simply use this grass stroke to ground the trunk. And there we have it, right? And at the end, essentially, if you want, at this point, there's always, you can darken one end of the trunk a bit more. So essentially what happens is, in this demonstration, I showed how, when you darken one end of the trunk more, and, and keep the other end light, it brings out the roundness of the trunk more. So essentially, one end should be the darkest, the middle one should be, middle tone, and this end should be the lightest. So that kind of, these three tones, lightest, middle, and dark, they bring out the roundness of the trunk nicely. So this is something you can do over here as well. So essentially, to do that, start by using these kind of parallel lines. So what I do is I draw one set of parallel lines, something like this. So what I'm doing is essentially I'm leaving this end, so I'm not taking the line all the way to the end. So this remains the lightest. Then I draw these parallel lines, one layer, and then I'll go back and add a bit more to this end to make it darker. So this, parallel lines define the middle tone here, and then I will go ahead and add a bit more over here to darken one end even more. So that will become my darkest end, this end. Then there is a middle tone because of the parallel lines, and there is this end which is lightest because it has no lines at all. So this is how you can just simply add a bit more of tonal variation on the trunk to give it a bit more feel for the roundness. So there we have it. And what happens is that your bark lines are still visible under these parallel lines, because the parallel lines are going in this direction. So essentially, to do this, you need to have a good control over being able to draw the parallel lines. So this is something you should practice extensively, because drawing these kind of parallel lines is one of the major kind of technique and one of the major strokes that I've used in a lot of other demonstrations. So essentially, we should practice extensively drawing these kind of parallel lines, and then just draw parallel lines, one layer all the way from here to this end, and then you can go back and then just darken one end even more using another set of parallel lines, just to give it more darker tone. So what happens is this results in this end being darkest, this having a middle tone, and this being the lightest, and that brings out even more the volume of the trunk. And finally, what we can do essentially is to just simply add a bit of ground cover over here, and essentially have a bit kind of background foliage. So for the background foliage, I will simply use these lines over here that we have seen in other demonstrations to indicate some kind of background foliage. So again, there are a lot of different possibilities. I've drawn a mountain, or you can have a distinct tree line, or any other elements, that we have seen in a lot of other demonstrations that I've covered in detail. So I won't cover those in details, but essentially, yeah. So this is how you can draw a nice, up close tree with a detailed bark visible, and then yeah, you can have other elements as well. And then I'll go ahead and just darken the base of the distant foliage a bit over here. And then at the end, what you can do is simply add a bit of dots or something like this, just to create a kind of ground cover for the distant ground. So I always like to provide this kind of nice ground cover over here. And there we have it. So this is how essentially you can draw a kind of different bark details. So essentially, again, the concept is very simple. You essentially draw the lines that represents kind of the grooves that a bark has, and then what you do is darken them in the center a bit like this, and then taper them. So essentially the lines have to taper. So again, if you have a line like this, so if you draw a line like this, and then you go back and then you simply move your pen a bit more over here, and then you darken it a bit more, and then taper it slightly. So this this becomes a kind of nice groove, not too deep, not too kind of it's not a crevice that because it's not so thick. So essentially then you just draw these grooves, and then it acquires then the bark acquires a nice feel of a grooved texture. This is how you can easily draw the bark in this manner for a tree up close. And there I will just simply add a bit more of distant foliage over here. And there we have it. So again, just to compare, so this is, kind of bark, that has nice grooves on it. And this is the kind of other bark that we drew that has a lot of, crevices around it. This is the kind of a ridged bark that we drew. And this is the other common bark that is found, that has these kind of bark pieces. So essentially, there are a lot of different ways of drawing bark texture. And what I've showed in the last few of my demonstrations is to capture some of those, those bark details. And this is a real fun thing to do, essentially, having a tree up close and showing its bark detail is a nice simple drawing that you can do anytime, and yeah, enjoy doing it. Thanks, take care, bye bye.